Welcome back to Second Breakfast. Today we're talking about another Game of Thrones chapter. If you've never been here before, why did you click on this episode? But if you haven't, we're reading through a Game of Thrones series. We're starting on the first book. We're a few chapters in. Today we're talking about Catelyn number 2. Cam, did you like this chapter? You seemed to.
It was a wonderful chapter. Yeah, I think it's weird because I like the variety in this book. I love getting to know all of these different POVs when it feels like we're reading 12 books at once. Mm-hmm. But I do have a special fondness for the Winterfell saga because it's a remixed Macbeth.
Well, and because it's so short-lived. Because this dynamic of the whole Stark family being here doesn't last very long. This is my transition into telling y'all that we do lots of spoilers on here because we have seen the whole show and Cam's read all the books. I've read half the books. So this is sort of a revisiting for us. So again, if you're new here, we're going to spoil everything. So just keep that in mind. Speaking of spoiling, let's give a recap of what happened in this chapter and then we can get into our discussion. I'm excited to hear about your Macbeth stuff, Cam, because it's been a couple weeks since we really talked about Macbeth.
I don't force it.
I know you don't.
But when it always pops up in the Winterfell chapters.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so in this chapter, this is Catelyn number 2. This is the first time we've gotten a chapter that's a number 2. We've only had our first chapters for a lot of people. Now we're starting to get repeats. It's exciting.
We haven't even done all of the number 1s.
No, there's still new people. There's Tyrion. There's
Arya, Sansa.
Jon.
No, we just did Jon.
Oh, right, we did Jon.
We did Ned and Jon.
Yeah, you're right. I keep forgetting that Jon is Jon's just been in every chapter, so I forget.
We've really been lingering in Winterfell. Yeah, we did. Yeah, because it was Dany a couple chapters ago, and then Ned and Jon.
Yeah, very exciting. Okay, anyway, so this is Catelyn to A Game of Thrones. So Catelyn and Ned are in Catelyn's bedchamber. They've just finished a bout of lovemaking. Good for them. The second they finish, Ned's like, okay, I'm not going to take the hand of the king. They both needed that.
Can you set the scene there? I'm sorry, but
sure.
He gets out of bed naked.
Uh-huh.
This is in an ice castle. He walks over to he opens the window naked and just kind of stands there with his hands on his hips.
Winter is coming. It does say that these chambers are the hottest part of the castle.
Not when you open the windows.
Yeah, I know. It's too funny. Maybe he overheats. Maybe he runs warm. He must. He belongs in the north. Whatever. Anyway, this is they're working through stuff. Okay. So Ned's I'm not going to take Robert's hand of the king offer. I can't do it. And Catelyn's what are you talking about? You have to take this offer. You can't refuse the king. Don't you see that? And you have to do this. And so they're kind of arguing about it. Not arguing. They're discussing. They're having a discussion about it. But then Maester Luwin comes in. Maester Luwin is, how do you do it? It's weird. In this book,
third wheel.
No one ever really describes what a maester is, but you just kind of understand. It's they're medical person / wise person / scholar, teaches the kids everything, helps deliver babies. He's just there and he knows everything. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so he says, really sorry to interrupt y'all. I have a really urgent message. And they're yeah, sure. Come in, whatever. They trust him. They like him. And basically it was just this wooden box that was left behind. No one saw who dropped it off. No one knows how it got there. And inside the box is a lens. And they're okay, what do we do with this? And Maester Luwin says, well, I actually found a little scroll hidden in a secret compartment in the box, and it's addressed to Catelyn, and it's from Lysa Arryn, Catelyn's sister, the wife of Jon Arryn, who died. And the message at first, Catelyn reads it, makes no sense at first, and then she remembers that she and Lysa had a secret language when they were kids, and so she figures it out, and she immediately burns the letter, and they're what did it say? And she says the letter says that Jon Arryn was murdered by Queen Cersei, and that is a big deal. She risked she risked everything to send this message to them, so it's a big deal. And they're well, shit. And so Catelyn's you have to go now. You have to go to find out the truth. You have to go to protect Robert, your best friend who you call a brother. And of course, you have to go to keep Lysa and her son safe as well. She's you have to go now that you know this information. And Ned kind of takes a minute and he agrees and knows that he has to go. But he insists on a few things. Number 1, Catelyn's going to have to stay behind with Robb. Robb needs to learn how to become Lord of Winterfell. Catelyn has to sort of prep him to make that happen. Rickon's also going to stay behind because he's 3. But the other kids, Sansa, Arya, and Bran, are all going to have to go with Ned. And this totally breaks Catelyn's heart. But Sansa has to go because she's now betrothed to Prince Joffrey. And so she has to sort of prove that devotion and go with them. Arya has to go because apparently she needs help like learning how to be a lady at court. She's 9, but whatever. And then they also want to bring Bran because Bran will sort of help bridge the divide between Robb and Joffrey. And like this like hurts Catelyn the most. She wants Bran to stay behind so bad because he's 7 years old. But Ned's like, no, he has to go with me. And then they come to, what do we do about Jon? Because Jon is, of course, Ned's bastard son. Catelyn is hoping that Ned will just take him with her because she hates Jon. But Ned's like, no, I can't bring my bastard child to court at King's Landing. Like, he's going to be completely rejected and, like, ostracized and is not going to fit in, and it's going to be terrible for him.
They'll read it as an insult.
Right, exactly. But Catelyn doesn't want him to stick around because he's not her son. And then Maester Luwin's like, oh, actually, Jon kind of told Benjen that he wants to go to the Wall, so maybe he could just do that. And they take a minute, and they're like, he's 14, but Ned's like, okay, fine, that's what has to happen. I'll tell him, before we leave. And so they sort of like, they figured out where everybody's going to go, what's going to happen next, and they're going to leave in about 2 weeks. We also, in this little chunk of story, get a little bit of backstory within Catelyn's brain, learning about Jon, and we sort of learn the story of Jon and where he came from. So during like Robert's rebellion, when they were taking over from King Aerys, Ned was away at war for like a year. He came back and he had Jon, and Catelyn was like, okay. And it's interesting because Catelyn is less offended by the like fact that Ned cheated and got someone pregnant than she is by his insistence on keeping Jon with him and bringing him to Winterfell. She's much more offended by that than like the actual cheating, because she says like they had just gotten married. She understands that like these things happen. He was away for a long time. He has a man's needs. I disagree with her logic, but it's interesting that that's her logic, right? She's more just offended that he brought the kid back with him.
That he's so visible.
Yes, and apparently Ned will never speak of the woman who of Jon's mother. And at one point, Catelyn does ask, and Ned just responds by saying, "Jon is my blood, and that is all you need know." Ding, 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 ding. Red flag, red flag, red flag. Right?
A little wiggle room there.
Yeah, like because Ned, he can't lie, so right. That's what he says.
But a half truth.
Yes, and so we learned that about Jon, and so Ned and the group that he's going to go with are going to leave in about 2 weeks, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of have one big idea to talk about. It seems like you have several. So would you like to maybe start us off, or do you want me to jump into my?
No, I can do a few.
Okay, great.
So I want to start with the Macbeth clarification, because the further we get into this book, the more we move away from the way Shakespeare sets the table in Macbeth. I think we have a lot of the same roles and same ideas that George R. R. Martin's playing with, but we get more and more deviations. And I like tracking those changes and alterations, because I think that's part of the spark and the creativity behind the scenes of this whole Winterfell saga. And the clarification I really got from this chapter is, for sure, Ned and Catelyn are not Macbeth and Lady Macbeth.
Okay.
But they exist in those exact roles.
Okay, what do you mean?
Things are just being remixed as we progress.
Okay.
We've got the same elements of the play. We even have some of the same scenes. It's just you slightly skew what's happening in the play, and you get new results. There's like a what-if factor in the way this book is being written.
Okay.
So instead of the Macbeth and Lady Macbeth characters gathering to plan a murder, in this chapter they're coming together to learn of a murder plot.
True, and Catelyn is the one driving it, just like Lady Macbeth does. That's really interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So they're not villains, but the same thing's happening. And
they're in the same roles. It's just their morality compass is a little bit different.
It's even happening in the same place and time within the larger plot. Like, this couple is gathering in their house after the king has arrived. Mm-hmm. But they're not the murderers. They're learning about the murder and trying to not stop it, but learn what happened and bring the person to justice.
Yeah.
So very different characters, but in the same position and in the same place and time in the narrative. I think there's another clarification or inversion here from the Shakespeare. The chapter opens with them having sex. Mm-hmm. And Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do not have any good passions between them.
No, they don't. Well, even at one point, Lady that whole monologue she has, unsex me here. I mean, you can read that in all kinds of ways. Maybe it's about fertility, but she sort of rejects any, the sexual connection between her and her husband is not important.
It's broken. There is a distance and a coldness between them. And at other points in the play, there is a direct, explicit mockery of his manhood that she uses to motivate him to go kill Duncan.
Yeah.
By questioning his, fertility and vitality and all these other things.
Virility.
Right. And there's none of that here.
Yeah.
There's like a healthy sex life in a good relationship. So I think that's another kind of throat-clearing clarification from the Macbeth.
Yeah.
Where we're going to play with a lot of the same elements, but we're shifting how the characters act and how they interact with each other.
Cool. I like it.
Another thing I want to play with is the interplay between the last couple chapters and this one, because we just had that wonderful couplet of Jon and Ned chapters. And that's where I talked about those distillation echoes, and there's less of that here, but I'm still watching for that as we move forward. I want to talk about the echoes, the similarities between Jon and Ned, because I think George is using those characters as prisms to reflect the other character. There's so much similarity between them.
I see that, yes.
As like the stoic, observant Northman.
Okay, yeah, I have stuff about that too, but I think let's hear from you first. This is good.
In those last two chapters, we saw them juxtaposed. And yes, there are slight differences, but it's mostly like age and station. The essence of these two men, it's very similar. They're very stubborn. They're very principled. And we
noble.
Yes, and more importantly, we see how they view each other. We're looking at those two previous chapters as bookends. So I started trying to look at this chapter through that same structural lens. This is something we played with a lot during the Witcher days and during the Tolkien days, but it hasn't arisen much so far in the Game of Thrones journey. But having just experienced that couplet, I wanted to see what was happening in the larger view of this Catelyn chapter. And I noticed that the chapter starts with Ned and Catelyn having sex, and she's hoping that she'll get pregnant. And then we end the chapter with her rejection of Jon as an unwanted son.
Yeah.
And in the intervening pages, George tells the story of Jon Snow's origin, his arrival, his young life. So George is setting up Catelyn's rejection of this maternal instinct to take care of this helpless, faultless baby, Jon Snow.
Right.
He doesn't come sauntering back into Winterfell. He's just a baby.
That's what really kills me. I'm like, be mad at Ned. Don't be mad at the child.
But you set up that like resistance to the maternal instinct, which she clearly has. You see how much she cares about 3-year-old Rickon, how much she wants to protect 7-year-old Bran. These are even young boys. We're setting an extremely clear parallel.
Yeah.
But George sets up that rejection by framing the chapter as almost the conception and rejection of an unwanted child.
Cool.
Where you see them conceive this idea of a child at the beginning, and then she rejects this idea of a child at the end of the chapter.
Wow.
And I want to touch on the way he does this, because we're sympathizing with Catelyn. We're sympathizing with Jon. And more importantly, we're observing everyone in the scene. It's an incredibly balanced telling of this particular fraction of the story. We're literally in Catelyn's point of view, but we've also just heard from Jon, and we know from the previous two chapters that Ned and Jon are incredibly alike. I mean, basically, Ned is Jon Sr. For all intents and purposes, he's also literally his advocate in this scene.
There's a lot in the narration in multiple chapters about how Jon looks the most like Ned, more than any of his other kids.
So no one is demonized. Jon isn't this, like, homewrecker, and Catelyn isn't a Disney stepmother. Like, there's a remarkable balance and depth and efficiency of character, to the point you keep making about this series. I just really admired the way this was structured.
I like that a lot. And yeah, I definitely, those similarities between the two really came together in this chapter, but also their differences, and this is what's really fun. So, surprise, surprise, I'm going to talk about seeing again. But it was so...
They're given a lens.
Okay, so
and
like...
he tells them it's to see things with.
Right. And like, okay, so there's a lot in here about seeing, specifically about Ned not being able to see and Catelyn being able to see. So we have lines like Catelyn says to Ned, "Can't you see the danger this would put us in?" She thinks to herself, she had to make him see. Why couldn't he see? And then, of course, they get the lens. And so, you know, Catelyn says a lens is an instrument to help us see. And she asks, what is it that they would have us see more clearly? Even Maester Luwin comes in, and this is our first time meeting Maester Luwin. And it's like the second line of his description. It says his eyes were gray and quick, and he saw much. So like painting Ned as like this guy who can't see the truth, can't see why he has to go down to King's Landing, but everybody else around him can see. And then of course we talk about Jon, because when Catelyn is thinking about Jon, it says, she might have overlooked a dozen bastards for Ned's sake, so long as they were out of sight. Jon was never out of sight. And so, of course, not only can Jon see, which we've established in previous episodes, I won't get into it here, Jon is, of course, within sight, and that also gives him power. And so I think what's happening here is we're really drawing attention to how blind Ned is. And I've talked about the Starks in general being blind, and like that's a problem they all have. And I think that's still true here because it is the wrong decision for Ned to go down to King's Landing, as we later find out. But I think what we're focusing on here is that Ned is the blindest of them all. You know, Catelyn knows and understands and sees before Ned that he has to go down to King's Landing. Lysa's letter is addressed to Catelyn. The information is being conveyed to Catelyn. Catelyn sees the truth about Jon Arryn before Ned does. And of course, even Maester Luwin seems to see better than Ned. We also know that Lysa's information is, of course, partly false. We learn that much later, but all the same, Ned is going to try to see the truth, but of course he doesn't ever get to the truth. And this is what's interesting, is that Ned at the very end, like when they're deciding what to do, Ned says, very well, I suppose it is for the best, meaning going down to King's Landing. And of course we know that is so not true. It is in fact for the worst, and it leads to the destruction and death of half their family and total like falling apart of everything. And that's what like starts the War of the Five Kings. And like everything that happens in this series is because Ned goes down to King's Landing.
But for his principles, it is the right thing to do.
Of course it is. And so that's what's so interesting. So I was thinking, at this point we can think of Ned as like one of our main characters, right? Yeah. Why make your main character so woefully wrong? Like, why make him be so misguided and so blind?
Well, he's not. I think it's just a priority thing.
Well, so I think what we're meant to glean from this is that his type of character, this person who is noble, is good for the sake of being good, sticks to their principles. He doesn't belong or work or succeed in this kind of world, in this story. It's not a moral judgment. It's not like George R. R. Martin telling us we should all be lying, conniving, selfish people. But it's more saying that this traditional, fantastical, chosen one hero who's like pure and good is not going to succeed in this world. But here's what's even more interesting is if you bring it back to Jon. Jon is also noble and good and wants to like do something important and like take responsibility and sacrifice his own desires and whatever to do a good thing. But Jon can see and Ned cannot. And Jon is not, and I don't mean to imply that Ned is naive, but Jon is certainly less naive than Ned because of his position, like you said earlier. And he has to like prove himself worthy and learn how best to navigate the world. And that's how he's able to succeed in a way that Ned does not. Not that Jon has it all rosy posy and that he does great, because we know that things do fall apart for him in ways, and like at one point he is killed. Like things get a little nuts for Jon. Briefly, but he succeeds and rises to power in a way that Ned does not. And I think where you can again like draw that distinction is Jon learns how to navigate the world and he opens his eyes. Ned says when Catelyn's saying you have to go down there, Ned says, "The South is a nest of adders I would do better to avoid." He doesn't want to try and figure it out. He doesn't want to try to navigate it and see the best way forward. He ends up begrudgingly deciding to go because he sees no other option. But of course, he's so completely wrong. He says it must be for the best. And of course it isn't. So I think that's sort of like that distinction of you can be this good and noble person, but you still have to be like open and like aware of truths and learn how to navigate it and not just try to like barrel through with your own principles of purity and nobility.
The thing that helps you to survive is the ability to adapt. And that's what Ned doesn't do. If Ned and Jon share part of their identity, I think they each have another influence leaning on them, and you can personify those to make sense of them better. Because, I mean, if you cut them in half, right? half of Jon is identical to half of Ned, but the other half of Ned is Jon Arryn, which is pure principle and tradition. The other half of Jon is Tyrion.
Yes.
Jon has a lot more gargoyle in him because Tyrion and Jon survive. Ned and
Jon Arryn
do not.
Right. Jon Arryn is killed by his own wife.
And I think that's it's that flexibility. And the more principled the character, the less flexible they are, because Ned's making this decision by this northern light that can help him, because the situation's always going to change. But if the principles are consistent, that's how he makes his decisions.
Right.
And I think Jon has to flex principles sometimes in the same way Tyrion does, which is why they are much more haunted at night, right?
Of course, yeah. Like, they're not, like, happy for it. Yeah.
It's a very difficult path.
Yeah.
But Ned doesn't have that. And I think Catelyn has a lot more of that pragmatism than Ned does, because she plays with that idea of perception throughout this chapter. There's a power. She takes ownership of this perception skill that she has that I think she sees is somewhat lacking in Ned. Because a lot of what I notice with the seen and unseen in this chapter is Catelyn being self-conscious or not about being naked.
Yeah.
Because, like, she covers up because she's cold.
Yeah.
And then the covers fall away because she's very interested in the letter.
Yeah.
She's prioritizing the health and well-being of her sister over her own sense of propriety or modesty or whatever. And then when she sees, oh shit, someone's going to try to kill one of the people I care about, she just jumps out of bed and walks over and makes fire. And she corrects Ned, because Ned's like, but what about the principle of no one seeing you naked?
Yeah, and she's like, Maester Lewin has seen me naked. It's fine.
Right, she corrects him with that pragmatism.
Yeah.
I think that's her showing she's a more flexible character than him. And it demonstrates that tragic, fatal difference between those two characters.
Yes, right. And, you can't completely fault Ned. Like,
no, of course.
Ned needs to be more flexible, but also the position he's in has not required flexibility the way that it has for somebody like Jon. Jon has to be flexible. Jon has to, like, learn how to, like, navigate his weird world and survive. And even then, like, when they go to their two destinations, Jon's going to go to the Wall, where things are harsh and cruel, and the people he's around are criminals and violent, like, scary, bad people. And of course, he's exposed to the wildlings and the White Walkers and everything beyond the Wall. Versus Ned, who goes down to sunny, warm King's Landing, where things are not rosy and beautiful. Like, there's a lot of corruption and terrible things happening down there, but in a sneaky way. And so, like, it's harder for Ned to, like, learn how to adapt and just, like, understand what's happening compared to Jon, who's just exposed right away in a really, like, harsh way. So it's different.
And I love the way George writes this, because you can see how things are going to work in macro. You can zoom out and look at the whole arc of the story and how these skills of perception and adaptation will serve these characters, but also you understand it almost in a metaphorical context, because in the moment it's like, yeah, I understand Ned not wanting other people to see his wife naked. Like, I get that.
Of
and
course.
I get the larger point about rigidity and principle.
Yes, every choice that Ned makes, I understand and I sympathize with, even if it is ultimately the wrong choice.
And I think that's the value of making one of your lead characters as less perceptive or skilled or correct than you could. I think it makes the world seem richer and more complicated. And when you have so many POVs, I think you need everyone to have blind spots to give everyone else something to do.
Absolutely.
It's a tapestry, this world.
And in the same way that I understand why Ned makes the choices he makes, I also understand why somebody like Tyrion makes the choices he makes. Again, even if I don't agree with them, I see what he's doing and I sympathize. So that's what makes it so fun.
Yeah. It's a really interesting chapter. I want to do a quick check-in on two of our kind of pet running theories that we're finding in every chapter so far.
Okay.
And this is Death and Prophecy. I'm doing these I'm moving it to like an update sort of segment now, because if it's a major thing, I'll talk about it at the beginning. But I keep finding it almost in between the lines of especially these Winterfell chapters. Death and Prophecy are both present here on a more conversational level. And obviously there's death, there's discussion of murder, there's the fear of death, that's always there. But prophecy, I think, is becoming more fruitful in these conversations, because it continues to exist in the way we talked about last time, in the Jon context, where I was talking about prophecy as more of a cultural idea.
Yeah.
I was talking about Jon not being the one who's going to inherit the family business. Like, there's that sort of concern about the future and being the son, the prophesied one. Like, those things don't have to be. metaphysical and spiritual. They can exist on a more grounded level. And I think this chapter is very much about futures and the way prophecy exists on that very meat and potatoes sort of level. Look at Lysa Arryn's letter, which evolves this idea of prophecy into almost a discussion of rumor. Because there's this allegation about someone killing someone else and the implicit willingness to kill other people.
Yeah.
But it's not a prophecy etched in stone. It's not a crystal ball that we find in the Department of Mysteries.
True. And there's even like a doubt at first. Ned's like, she's blind with grief. Like, there's no way this is true. And Catelyn has to say, like, she wouldn't have taken such a big risk if she wasn't absolutely sure. But there's still doubt and fear. And even like, she's like, you have to go down to find out the truth. Like, they're still not totally sure what happened.
And it comes to us in basically dialogue from this handwritten note. It feels more conversational. Prophecy is becoming something more lived in, more fallible. It's not set in stone, and I think that's the point. Again, Macbeth, I think when you talk about prophecy and death, you have to talk about Macbeth. Macbeth is a play about the reaction to prophecy. What an awareness of what's going to happen in the future, or this prophecy might be true, how that poisons and ruins the human mind. So I think this evolution from prophecy to rumor, I think that gets more into the weeds, the insidious kind of personal interactions, instead of taking something as gospel.
Well, and I think that's more true to this world in the way that it is more grounded and personal and individual and people-centered instead of like big picture, God magic centered. There is still magic and there are gods in this world, but not in this like overarching, all-powerful way.
We're getting these like sociological prophecies, and I think George doubles down on that idea. It starts with the Lysa Arryn letter and that idea of rumor, and then I think it deepens with that touch of backstory about Jon's mother's identity. Because that's all about whispers. Yeah, that's about what people are saying throughout Winterfell. Yeah. And how she's reacting to that and interpreting that. And it's about her reputation as much as it is about Jon's true parentage. So there are concerns beyond the literal truth of a prophecy, of a rumor, of revelation.
Yeah, how does what people think it is affect things? It's not just what the actual truth is.
And I think this chapter, in large part, is furthering the cross-pollination between death and prophecy. We're seeing how intertwined these two ideas are. And that serves to illustrate how deadly and dangerous prophecy and rumors and oaths can be. And I think George is slipping that last part right in at the end, because we're just tinging the danger of these characters' possible futures with references to the Night's Watch. And that involves an oath. Yes. You're signing up for this sort of prophesied future.
That's true. You're kind of like determining your own fate right there.
And maybe the counterpart there is the discussion or the reference to Ned's bloody military service.
Yeah.
So we're getting discussion of oaths and rumors, and I think those are those sociological evolutions of the discussion of prophecy that we started with.
And there's also an element of like more like flexibility in that prophecy, because we learn more about, Catelyn was originally supposed to marry Ned's brother, Brandon, and Brandon was the older brother. He was supposed to be Lord of Winterfell, and that all went wrong. But you see Ned sort of lamenting that, like, this should have been him doing this stuff. I shouldn't have to be making these decisions. Like, I wish it wasn't this way. It was supposed to be this other way. Like, that's what the prophecy said, right? There was no actual prophecy, but that's like what was supposed to be, and now it's not. And so there's room for prophecy to change or not go the way you think it's going to go.
And what broke that prophecy?
Death. Murder.
This is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He's more and more entangling these ideas as we get deeper into the story.
Very cool. Very cool. I love that.
Really rich chapter. I mean,
it was,
on its face, very interesting. The conversations are great. I love that structure of beginning with Ned and Catelyn in bed and then seeing this sort of conversation curdle and turn into this discussion of Jon Snow by the end. That was awesome. But the ideas that are present, I think you're right. As we proceed through the book, we get more and more subtext and culture and things to talk about. So I found this to be maybe the richest chapter we've gotten so far. Yeah,
I think I agree with you there in lots of ways. Yeah, this one was fun.
Cool.
Well, okay, so next week we have Arya.
Yes,
for the first time. I love Arya as a character, and I love reading from Arya.
Yeah, me too.
I just think she's a really great character. I'm so excited. So that's going to be really fun. But yeah, so tune in next week. Well, first of all, let us know what you thought of this chapter. What do you think about the ideas we put forth? Are we way off? Are we 100% right? Only answer if it's the last one. No, I'm just kidding. And you can, if you're on YouTube, you can obviously comment below, like and subscribe, all of that. If you're listening on a podcast platform, you can send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. You can also message us on Instagram, secondbreakfastpod. And if you're on Patreon, you can of course comment below there. If you're not on Patreon, we offer a bonus episode every single month for $2 a month, and of course that membership also grants you access to our whole back catalog of bonus episodes. We cover all kinds of stuff on there. Sometimes it's like another like work of art we're excited about. Or what we've been doing lately is our series called The Breakfast Buffet, where we do like a roundup of a lot of the stuff we've been, watching, listening to, looking at, thinking about recently. And that actually, the one for January is coming out next Tuesday.
Yes, it is.
That's our volume 4. We're talking about, what are we talking about on that one?
We are talking about the Iron Claw, Ferrari, Poor Things, and Godzilla -1.
Yeah, so lots of fun stuff there. So again, Second Breakfast Pod is our Patreon. Links are all in the description. Check that out.
And that's about an hour, I believe, that episode. And we've got a lot of stuff to say about those. We'll have a little teaser out on YouTube and on podcast platforms next Tuesday, just to wet your whistle.
Yes.
To entice you to subscribe and get the entire episode there. And a little cross promotion. This past Tuesday, we just did an episode about Fallout 3. That was more of a retrospective. That was a little more personal than we usually get.
Yeah.
That was me talking about my history with a game that popped off with thematic resonance at the absolute worst moment of my life. And that's a pretty interesting episode. I enjoyed recording that one. That was strange to prep for.
Yeah, I enjoyed hearing from you about that. If you want more fantasy coverage from us, we have also gone through the entirety of the Lord of the Rings series as well as the Witcher series. Those are only available on podcast platforms right now. They're not out on YouTube, but you can find us anywhere you find podcasts, and we did going all the way back to May 2020. So check out those episodes.
Years of coverage.
If you want to dive into more of our fantasy literary analysis, chapter by chapter breakdowns.
And if you're more into fantasy games, we've also done, we're still doing ongoing coverage of Diablo 4, and we're doing more and more coverage of Path of Exile.
Yeah, and more fantasy game content to come. I'll leave it at that.
Yes, indeed.
If you listen to our Breckies episode, you know what I'm talking about.
Look at this. Look at this cross-promotion.
Look at this. Look at us.
All right, so we'll be back on Friday with Aria. We'll be back on Tuesday with the Breakfast Buffet Volume 4, and then Friday with the first chapter from Aria's POV.
Amazing. All right, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.